Now let's talk about data types. Understanding data types is going to be fundamental to writing good, efficient code. And so in this two-part video, I'm going to cover data types. Now in part one, we're just going to kind of talk about data types. And in part two, I actually want to go through a list and show you some of them, okay? But first of all, understand that when I create a variable, I'm going to assign that variable a data type. Now we've talked about that in previous videos. What I want to really hone in on these two videos is exactly what different data types are out there and how you should use them. Well, a data type determines two things. Number one, what kind of data we can store in a variable, and then actually how much data that variable can hold. Now let's go back to the first one. The data type for a variable is one of the first things that we're going to do, one of our first lines of defense against bugs in our code. Because if I set a data type of, say, a float, some sort of a floating point data type, then that means that I'm going to have decimals and fractional values in there, all right? Well, if I just arbitrarily change that data type somewhere in my program to an integer data type, then that means it can only store whole numbers, and it's going to drop off, you're just going to kind of lop off those fractional numbers and throw them out of the way. Now that's going to create a mathematical problem in my program, or an inconsistency or an erroneous calculation. But if the compiler's not watching out for that, it won't throw an error. And that could be really hard to chase down. So one of the first things that we do is we watch our data types and we kind of police those and then make sure that the data that we put in there is the only type data we can put in there, and it can't inadvertently change. Now we can explicitly convert it, but we have to be very careful about how we just change it, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Now the next important thing that a data type does for us is it determines how much data a variable can hold. Different data types create variables that consume different amounts of memory. Now the best way to think about this is to think about your attic or your garage, wherever you store all your junk, and I know you've got junk, okay? Because if you're going to store, say, 5 or 6 pairs of shoes, these are your favorite shoes, you don't want to get rid of them, so you put them in a box. Now, you don't want to use a box that takes up half the room just to store those 5 or 6 pairs of shoes. You want a box just big enough to hold the shoes and no more. We want to do the same thing with our data types. We want to use a data type that will store our number or our characters or whatever, but we don't want to waste a lot of memory space for storage that we don't really need. Okay, so we'll talk about that in part 2 when we look at the space on the actual data types. Well, understand now in C++, the ISO IEC standard C++ provides fundamental data types, and then when you jump over into the CLI world, or quote the Bill Gates world if you will, there's a few additional data types. Okay, now I'm going to concentrate in this two-part video on the ISO IEC standard types. Okay, now there are 3 categories of fundamental data types in ISO IEC, and let's look at those here. Integers, and these are whole numbers, right? Non-fractional numbers, positive or negative. Then there's non-integral values, and in English that means floating point or decimal numbers or fractional numbers. And then there's void. Now we won't go into void in these 2 videos, but just understand that void means there's an empty set of values or there's no type at all been assigned. It just means nothing's there. All right. Now in part 2, I want to actually go through the various data types and kind of give you an idea of what you need to know on these things, all right? Because part of being a good programmer is knowing what data type to use when. And that way you're managing your memory efficiently, you're managing your code efficiently, you're helping your code to run faster, more efficiently, just all kind of cool things are happening. So if you'll join me in part 2, we're going to start right here on this screen, and we're going to go through some of these fundamental data types.